saw a lot of really unfortunate incidents. There were a lot of suicides and suicide attempts. We really wanted to better understand why our mental health care system was this way. And that set us off on this journey to like what we could do to help solve the problem.
Were you considering of starting a business, or was it more of a, let me discover what's going on?
On my end, I was open to just like really trying to understand the problem first. But as we continued to look into it, it became clear that no one was addressing it in the way that we thought it should be addressed. Starting our own company was the best way to really take matters into our own hands. We identified that clinicians really needed what we were building. We also identified that the types of data that was being gathered would be highly invaluable to research. Our vision is to be the number one software for private practice psychiatrists and to be a part of every future drug approval in some way.
If we get 100 years into the future and we look backwards, what are the things that we're going to say in psychiatry that are totally wrong?
So many things, all the things. First off,
super. Lucia, it's good to see you again. Excited to do this discussion together. I wanted to see, maybe let's start with what is Osmind, and then let's get into the timeline of how you started.
Yeah, great to see you. And thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to chat about our journey today. So yeah, I'm Lucia. I'm co-founder and CEO here at Osmind, and we offer software for clinicians and researchers in psychiatry. So we fundamentally believe that the entire industry of psychiatry and mental health are changing. And we're trying to help the frontline clinicians that are trying to provide better care and also help researchers discover better treatments.
Super. What were you doing before starting Osmind?
Yeah. So I've been in healthcare my entire career. I was one of those people that went into undergrad thinking that they were going to become a doctor. I actually really loved chemistry, so I ended up majoring in chemistry. But I felt like I could make a bigger impact on the business side of healthcare. And honestly, I didn't love standing up all the time in lab in chem. So those are like the two honest reasons. And then I ended up going into finance right after college, focusing on healthcare companies. So I was in investment banking and investing, all the while focused on helping large biopharma companies and then investing in healthcare IT companies. That was an amazing experience. I got to work with both huge companies and smaller companies that were looking to scale and really deeply began to understand the problems and opportunities in the healthcare system. Specifically, when I was on the investing side, I had the opportunity to invest in a specialty-based EHR, which is what we are now building. So it was definitely inspiring to see how much clinicians got improvement in their workflows and reduced burnout by using better software. Despite all of that and the awesome experience I had, I really wanted to build something, and I felt like being even closer to the patient would mean a lot more to me. So I ended up leaving my finance job in New York City. I took a huge pay cut. I came out to the Bay Area, which is where I'm from, and I joined an early stage neuroscience biotech startup called Verge Genomics. And the company is doing really well. They just had their first human dosing in a clinical trial recently. And at the time, it was a 12-person company. All of their assets were in preclinical stages. So they're just doing like stem cell testing, starting to do animal testing on drugs that they had found using AI for patients with ALS and Parkinson's and other neuro diseases. So that was an incredible experience. I got to work hand in hand with the CEO there, and it was really inspiring and honestly like a great kind of backseat view into what it's like to build a company from the early stages. And it also inspired me with seeing firsthand how much the science in neuroscience is really changing. And ultimately that combined with my prior experience made me realize that I wanted to start Osmind a few years later.
Super. Did you join Stanford after that?
Yeah. So after Verge, I was at Stanford in their business school for 2 years. And that's also where I met my co-founder. And yeah, it was an awesome experience. GSB is like an incredible, magical place where everyone can dream big. So it was a great breeding ground for starting a company too.
That's very interesting. Can we speak a bit about more about Stanford? I believe I met so many folks that went through that program. What do you think that makes it interesting for people to join?
Yeah, it's so funny because I feel like Stanford paints itself as like the anti-business school a little bit. Like, at least for me, my impression of people going to business school was like people who like to wear suits for fun and are really intense and carry around briefcases and like that kind of vibe. And it's not like that at all. I think they do a great job of pulling people from very different backgrounds. So my background, like the finance part, was certainly more traditional, but having worked at a startup, I was one of, a minority of people with that background. There are a lot of people that worked at nonprofits, that worked, in tech, like all across, and they all wanted to do different things. So I think they do a really good job of curating a very unique and diverse not patient, also patients, student base. And so and when we were at GSB, the curriculum is also really interesting because there's definitely like your hard skills, take finance, take accounting, product management, all that sort of stuff. But there's a big emphasis on, for lack of better words, feelings and emotions. And actually the most popular class at GSB is a class called Touchy Feely. I don't know if you've heard about it. Yes, yeah. It is infamous, but it's a really interesting setup where they put students in a group of 12 people that meet throughout, the quarter. And it's like completely unstructured. There's a facilitator, but they don't really do too much. You basically just sit in a room and talk about your feelings and kind of like egg each other on and try to push each other's buttons to see like what to really help you define your leadership style. And it's a class where you have the freedom to give people honest feedback of, hey, like you came off like an asshole, or when I first met you, this is my impression of you. So like it was a really interesting, basically lab to better dissect your leadership style and come away with a lot more self-awareness. So I think that's just like one example of how Stanford and GSB specifically it's really into self-awareness, introspection and emotions. And because of that, I think it attracts a certain type of person that definitely wants to, do big in the business world and make a big impact, but also wants to develop themselves as a person as well.
Why would you say that specific course is so popular?
Yeah, I think it's because it is like, I don't want to say the word controversial, but because of the way it's set up, how it's so unstructured, and because people like really dive into like juicy things, it becomes pretty popular. For example, one of the exercises that they have you do in that group of 12 is what's called the influence line. And so without speaking, they have all 12 people try to arrange themselves in order of most influential to least influential. And so you could imagine something like that. That's like, oh, wow. Like I would never do that in any other part of my life. But like, that's information I want to know, because if I'm not influential enough, I want to know how I make myself more influential. Right. Or if I'm at the top of the line, I want to know what I'm doing right. And it's basically just a place where social constructs break down and you can kind of just do whatever because it's all for the sake of learning.
Interesting. Can you recall what did the most influential people do?
Yeah, I think that was really interesting too. I think like you would think that perhaps, at least for me, the story I had going into it was like the loudest people are going to be the most influential, or, the people that are of a certain background or economic status or whatever are going to be the most influential. And that definitely wasn't the case. I think in general, the people that were more influential were the ones that were more honest and authentic and vulnerable. The people that were willing to speak their mind, not speak over people, but to be really self-aware and respectful of other people in the room. Those people tended to be towards the front of the line. And I think that was like really a big aha moment for me in terms of my own leadership style. And I'm sure everyone else in the room too. So yeah, those were the themes that came up in that exercise.
Very interesting. And how did you meet your co-founder? I believe you met there as well.
Yeah. So we met in a healthcare IT class, very nerdy. That was cross-listed between the GSB and the med school. So my co-founder was in medical school at the time, and he's since gone on leave from that. But yeah, we met in a class. We randomly were paired up on a final project, and then we stayed friends after. So yeah, in the months that followed, we got to hang out a lot, and essentially we talked a lot about the things that we cared about. And we both had our own perspectives on the healthcare system, and mental health came up as a frequent topic. Both of us grew up in the Bay Area, and there are mental health challenges everywhere, and especially in the Bay Area, it's something that's so stigmatized because children growing up have a lot of pressure. And for me, I saw a lot of really unfortunate incidents. There were a lot of suicides and suicide attempts, both within my immediate social circle and in the Bay Area community at large. And my co-founder had seen that as well. And so we really wanted to better understand why our mental health system was this way. And that set us off on this journey to like deeply understand and talk to a bunch of people what we could do to help solve the problem.
At the point, were you considering of starting a business, or was it more of a, let me discover what's going on here?
Yeah, more of the latter. Good question. Yeah. I mean, I think there's definitely different archetypes of founders. There are some people who are like, God, like I need to start a business. Like that's my one goal in life. I totally respect that. On my end, I think I had seen both the pros and cons of starting a business. Being at a startup beforehand, I saw like some of the downsides too of, oh man, talking to investors and kind of having to do that song and dance and like having to do everything yourself like that. There were a lot of like difficulties too. So on my end, I was open to just like really trying to understand the problem first. And I wasn't tied to like, I need to start a company to solve this. I was open to finding another company or another early stage venture that might have been tackling it too. But as we continued to look into it, it became clear that no one was addressing it in the way that we thought it should be addressed, and that like starting our own company was the best way to really take matters into our own hands and build the company that we wanted to build.
Very interesting. And then what was the next immediate step? Was it getting into Y Combinator or what's your product?
Yeah. So yeah, all the timing was very serendipitous. We met in 2019, and then we like started thinking about mental health and space in earnest in early 2020. And so, early 2020 is like very fortuitous timing because COVID hit. COVID hit in March, and so it was like this wild time where our problem at hand all of a sudden was magnified. It was magnified by like 10x because people were in so much suffering across the world. And actually, the first thing that we did has nothing to do with the product that we have right now. We spun up a community for patients to find peer support for each other. Now it's actually linked in our product because we serve providers who serve patients, and those patients have access to our our private and anonymous community. But that was like the first thing that we decided to do because COVID was such a big need. So I think the learning from there was, even though that wasn't part of our product, it was like truly about needs finding and like taking needs finding to the extreme of what is the most immediate and pressing need. In general, though, like what we really thought about was why mental health care as a problem is so broken. And we really boiled it down to a data problem. In psychiatry, specifically with patients that are the most affected, standard of care hasn't been innovated on in decades. If we think about fields like oncology, where even though cancer is not a solved problem, mortality rates have dropped a lot in the last 20 years because innovation has improved the standard of care and the types of treatments that we have. So yeah, in mental health care, that we do have optimism that same trend is happening. At Stanford, we saw a lot of the cutting edge research that's happening in the labs, a lot of neuroscience innovation, a lot of new treatment innovation. However, none of that's actually going to get to patients unless providers can easily offer those. And if providers have a more data-driven way of offering the best type of care to patients. Right now, how the standard of care works is if a patient is going to a provider will kind of just make their best guess. They might do like an intake with a patient, listen to them for an hour, and then just guess what works best for them. And the treatments that we're using are from the 1970s. So it's been really 50 years since we've had something new. And for your reference, in the 1970s, women weren't even allowed in clinical trials. So you can imagine how backwards like these medications are that so many Americans are on. And it's really because it boils down to we don't have a way to get great treatments to patients, and we don't have a feedback loop of what's working so that we can continuously iterate on that care protocol. So with that, like kind of understanding and working backwards from the need statements, we really try to talk to as many people as possible. We talked to all the researchers at Stanford for the most part. We talked to a lot of psychiatrists in the community. And we triangulated on the problem statement and ultimately what we thought our best solution was. And as soon as we had an idea for a solution, we like mocked things up. We really tried to prioritize quote unquote speed to market or speed to validation. And we started to see if people would be interested in buying what we perceived as a great software system to allow providers to treat patients in a more data-driven way. When we had this mock-up, again, we didn't even have a product. We had just a Figma mock-up. We would go and we literally sat with doctors in their offices, walked them through the mock-up and said, hey, is this solving your needs? How much would you pay for this? I'm a big believer in like trying to get to the dollars, not because like, we're capitalists or whatever, but like because you really need to understand what is the true willingness to pay and like, is your solution really resonating? I think a big pitfall of needs finding is people are really nice and they don't want to shoot your idea down. They're going to be like, oh, this is great. Yeah, I would buy it. But like, get them to sign something. Get them to sign something that's like, if I build it, you're going to have to buy it from me, And that's when the rubber really meets the road. So that's what we tried to do. And we actually got a lot of those signed LOIs that stated that people really wanted us to build this thing. And at that point is when the timing matched up and we applied to Y Combinator with those LOIs in hand. We, again, didn't have a product yet. And then we did Y Combinator in the summer of 2020.
At the point, did you know that it's going to become a big business? Like, was it obvious that the clinicians, for example, would be paying a lot for this solution? Or was it more of a, we're solving the problem for the beginning, we're going to think about this later?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think from the beginning, we've always wanted to build a big business because we think that there is a lot of change that needs to happen in mental health care. So the second side of the coin that I haven't yet talked about is the impact on research and life sciences. So we identified that this clinicians really needed what we were building and the software. We also identified that the types of data that was being gathered would be highly invaluable to research. And that right now in the pharmaceutical space, for example, the concept of real world data is very primitive. If we look at other fields like oncology too, you've got companies like Flatiron, like Concert, and others that have made a huge impact on the field, that have actually provided data that are used in regulatory studies and drug approvals. But in psychiatry, the same thing isn't there because it's so hard to get meaningful data from the real world care settings. So we thought that our tool for psychiatrists could also be used to gather real world data. And then we would have a second part of our business that would be working with life sciences companies, analyzing that data, publishing papers, recruiting patients for clinical trials, and doing all of that. So that was sort of the broader vision, that we always knew that the clinical software would be one piece of the puzzle, but for us to truly make the biggest impact, we would need all of that to come to fruition.
If we go a bit deeper there, why is there less availability of data in this space?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Okay. A lot of different reasons. I would frame it in two different ways. One is like clinical behavior, which I think behavior can never be separated from technology, because I truly believe that if you have better technology, you can influence behavior. You can't always completely change it, but you can influence it. And so psychiatrists and mental health providers aren't logging all the information that would be helpful to understand from a research perspective. The concept, for example, of treatment-resistant depression, that's like a highly used term in the life sciences space. That's oftentimes indications on drugs, but there's no official TRD diagnosis in reality. And our whole diagnostic framework in mental health is based off of the DSM, which is a diagnostic manual, that doesn't perfectly, we don't know enough about how to describe mental health conditions. And so we're kind of making these guesses that are very broad and very loose in description. And so clinicians are doing their best trying to diagnose patients, trying to treat patients, but there isn't enough granular ways to describe what is happening with patients. And therefore we don't have good data there. And then the second is what I mentioned on the technology perspective. There's nowhere to put that either. The way that systems are designed now isn't for data capture. Most systems are like free texts, that conversation we were just talking about that a provider has with their patient, that's what they record, or maybe they don't even record it at all, or maybe they put it on paper. And so it's both the quality and information within the data and the ability to capture it that are broken in the space.
What I'm wondering is this not the case why is this not the case in the other aspects as well? And it's only in psychiatry that the problem is bigger.
Yeah, good question. I think it's because mental health and psychiatry as a field have previously been viewed as less, for lack of better words, rigorous, quantitative, objective, right? What we have right now, for example, with outcomes in cancer, if an oncologist is going to treat breast cancer or something, they'll actually go and measure the tumor and look at tumor progression. Does the oncologist ask the patient, hey, do you feel like your tumor got smaller? No, they don't ask that question. They go and measure it. But in psychiatry, the way we measure progression is we ask the patient, do you feel better? Have you been sleeping better? Right. And so I'm not blaming the field for like, that's just the way it is. It's because there hasn't been innovation, and because the brain is so complex that we're at this place where the data descriptions are much more hand wavy. And so it's much harder to collect high quality data as well.
Very interesting. So it's also a limitation about the technology we have about understanding the brain.
Yes.
Okay, super interesting. And then you mentioned Y Combinator. You went to YC with all the LOIs. How was your experience there?
Yeah, it was great. It was challenging in some ways because it was the first all remote batch of YC. And so we were doing it on Zoom. It was the middle of COVID. It's hard to connect socially. So I think that was something that I was bummed out that we didn't have that full experience. On the other hand, YC did a great job of adapting quickly and bringing in speakers that maybe they wouldn't have had otherwise because they could be Zoom. So it was a great experience. I think the biggest thing we got out of it was really that like urgency mindset and accountability of like everyone is racing towards demo day and everyone wants to crush demo day. So we're all like working around the clock. I think my co-founder and I at one point had near like 24-hour shifts because he's a night owl and I'm like a morning person. And so we would just like overlap for a few hours in the, certain parts of the day and then cover the rest of it. And we were, working around the clock to we built our MVP during that time. We had brought on a founding engineer. So we had the specs that I had mentioned. We started to build it out. And then towards the end of the summer, we actually did have some of our first customers sign on. So it was a really productive time. We got great advice from the partners, heard some great talks, and then we ended up raising our seed round before demo day happened.
Very interesting. And then like would you say that the advice you got there was maybe start charging customers, have the product in their hands and so on? Or do you have a specific insight that was very, very helpful to you?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think YC is great at, again, pushing that urgency mindset and trying to like be really close to users, trying to ship quickly and get an MVP out there as fast as possible. Because I think we talked about just now that it's really easy to mask willingness to pay because people are too nice. I think, the other challenge is if you don't actually build something and get users to use it, like you don't truly know user feedback. You can show people mock-ups all day, but at some point you're going to need to ship. And so we did ship and then we did start charging for it right away. I think in hindsight, I might have wanted to spend more time on the actual shipping and iteration of it versus like trying to figure out go-to-market too early. I think we spent a lot of time thinking about go-to-market too. And I do think that that's important, but I think that came at the expense of really iterating quickly on product and focusing purely on user feedback. So we were thinking a little bit too much about, the money and how to monetize it. So, I think YC though was great at pushing us to ship quickly.
That's very interesting. What I'm thinking is in the settings of the clinicians, how fast can you move? I would be expecting them. It's not like a developer that can adopt your product very fast. Like you probably need to show studies. You probably need to show some very, very different facts, and the kind of timelines that they're going to buy your product are different. How did you approach it?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So our approach has been to go where providers are, we felt the most underserved in the mental health care space. And we think that that's mostly in the independent practice setting.
Okay.
Psychiatry is highly fragmented. The average practice size is 1.2 providers. So a lot of these people are like solo entrepreneurs that are doing their thing. So like you really relate to them. So we ended up selling, and our go-to-market today is still largely SMB. So that allowed us to iterate more quickly too, because actually at one point during YC, it was, again, in the middle of COVID and people in the Bay Area are a lot more conservative than other places. So we couldn't talk to users in person. So we did a road trip down to LA and we like knocked on a bunch of doctors' offices. Like we didn't get called back for a lot of them. And we literally just busted down their doors just to talk to them. I think like literally visiting people in person, going for S&B allowed us to move more quickly. Of course, S&B has, its own sets of trade-offs and considerations too. But from a shipping perspective, that did help us move more quickly.
Interesting. And then the MVP that you had at the beginning was solving what problem?
Yeah. So our product has since evolved. Our MVP, the problem we identified was mental health providers don't have a good way to track patient outcomes and know how patients are doing in between visits. And like, as you can imagine, when a mental health provider sees a patient, they're seeing a patient for, 1 hour of the past hundreds of hours that since they last saw them. And so how are they supposed to make a treatment or diagnosis decision just based off of that? We wanted to provide more interim feedback between visits. And so that's the problem that we were trying to solve with our MVP. I think based on what you do, as you know, like we would love to incorporate digital measures at some point. What we really started with was the standard of care, which is questionnaires. Most of mental health is based off of self-reported questionnaires or clinicians asking questions to patients. And that's what we tried to automate from the start.
And can we speak about the product evolution over time? You started with this, then how did the product evolve until what it is?
Yeah, good question. So we started with that, and it was a point solution. It was very focused on tracking outcomes for patients. What we saw over time was that two things. Clinicians were reluctant to use a solution that didn't integrate with their existing electronic medical records. And electronic medical records are like the central hub for clinicians. If you ever go to the doctor and like clinicians are like typing away furiously, they're probably typing into their EMR because it needs to record like all the patient medical visits, prescribed, schedules, bills, all of that. And providers didn't want to use something that was outside of that system. And secondly, providers didn't like their existing EHRs. They kept on complaining to us and they kept on saying, oh, like this outcomes thing is so great. Like, can you guys offer more? Like, I'd love to use you instead of our EHR. And so over time, we like kept on hearing these things. I think probably over the span of really decided after 6 months of being in the market and keeping on hearing these things that it would be better for us to build the whole thing. Simultaneously, we had started talking with life sciences companies, so biotech and pharmaceutical companies, and they were really interested in better understanding the outcomes too. So they wanted to know how patients were responding to certain treatments. Could they advocate for better insurance coverage of, let's say, this new drug that got approved because they're showing that patients actually get better, maybe even better than they had in clinical trial settings. But we weren't getting enough of the data we could get even more data to prove that point. Because what we were collecting was only outcomes data. If we could better understand their prescription information, medical history, a deeper understanding of their diagnosis, what happens during the visits, then we could paint more of a holistic picture. And so those two learnings of providers, want to use something that's more of a full system. They don't like their system, and there's more value in the data. If we're able to put that all together, made us realize that we should be building the full thing. And so that's what we embarked to do, is to build a full EHR. And that's what we have now. It's a full EHR that does everything that I just described for independent practices in psychiatry.
I'm guessing that the first pushback there was, we already have our system. It's going to take a lot of time for us to change. Was this one of the considerations that you had at the time?
Yeah, big consideration. That was why we didn't want to do it in the first place. We were like, oh, how are we going to replace all of these existing systems? So when we heard that feedback from providers that they actually did want a system, we were pretty skeptical at first. To your point, we were like, okay, well, maybe it's just a few providers and maybe it's a subset of the market. We ended up doing quite a bit more research to understand like what existing providers were using. Of course, because we were talking to all these providers, we started marking down other systems that they were using. And it became clear to us that there was no incumbent system. So it wasn't like Epic, right? Like none of these providers are using Epic because they're too small. And there was no incumbent. A lot of providers were using pen and paper still because they didn't like anything that was out there. Yeah. And the third thing that we realized was that the clinical practice is changing and using outcomes is becoming more prevalent, but also providers are offering new treatments. So things like FDA approved psychedelic medicine or TMS, Spravato, all these new treatments where their existing EHRs weren't well built for those workflows. If you think about what's happening to the field of psychiatry, it's going from, prescribing and then patients just like go and take that at home to procedural. Like psychiatrists are becoming more similar to people that, work in the OR or surgeons because they're doing a procedure on a patient in the office. And the workflows that are required of that are vastly different than what existing softwares were offering. So summarizing all of that, the market research that we determined to make us comfortable with this change was that there was enough of a need, providers were asking for it, but also there was like a fundamental disjointment in the system where workflows were changing and new software was going to be needed.
Super. And at that time, like, how were you thinking about fundraising? I believe you did a
Yeah.
seed round after YC. How were
Yeah.
you thinking about this, and what can founders learn from your experience?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So we did a seed round at the end of YC, and then we raised our Series A about 9 months later. And then we did our Series B about a year later. So
Wow.
really fast journey for sure. Definitely kind of took advantage of the market tailwinds, and we're able to like be well capitalized, especially now for this environment. Um, in general, I think what really resonated with investors was like this big, bold vision that we had, like that we want to transform mental health and psychiatry by making it more data driven. And I think people really appreciated that we were taking this really big swing. And I think that goes back to how VC investors are motivated. Like they want to go for something that's going to be that 100x, right? Like if this really works, then we're going to be like Flatiron Health that, exited for multiple billions of dollars or more than that. And so, I think that that's what was really compelling to VC investors. The second was like the general tailwinds of the space. We were working in this mental health space, which got a lot of attention during COVID. In addition, a lot of our providers were offering novel treatments. So things again like psychedelic medicine, and there was a lot of excitement around that. And so I think we were able to really play into that. What I would tell other founders is to, if they want to go the VC back route, which again, is not for everyone, right? But if they want to go for the VC back route, is really think big about vision, especially if you're an early stage founder. Vision and team are really all that matter at that point. So you have to have the credibility to go after your big vision. And then second is like, to the extent you can position yourself in a growing market, like, that, like someone had a quote of like, I would rather pick a, bad idea or bad team in a great market than vice versa, because like market is all rising tides lift all boats. So try to position yourself in that direction.
That's very interesting. I think I was reading this very lately as well. Considering that, how do you choose a good investor?
Oh yeah. We've been really fortunate to work with great investors, and our board is small but mighty. And our last investor from our Series B is on our board. I think that he's been incredible to work with. It's Justin Cow from DSJ Growth. And a big difference that we've noticed is he's an operator by background. He has a finance background. He's been in investing before, but he did co-found another health tech company. And that's made a huge difference in terms of the level of comfort we've had, bringing up tough questions, difficult situations, like being honest about some of the speed bumps in the journey. And not to say that that's not possible with people who don't have operating backgrounds, but for us, it did make a big difference in the like level of understanding that he had. For example, I think at one point I told one of our non-operator investors, like, oh, I need to, make a big leadership change. I need to let go of one of my leadership team members. And for whatever reason, this person maybe was earlier in their career or, hadn't been on the operating side, was very concerned, rightfully so, but very, very concerned. And I told Justin something similar, and, he's like, yeah, it happens, like do it as fast as possible, like give me all this advice about how to actually do the change. Right. And so I think it's just a very different mentality of like they've been in your shoes. So that's, I think, a big path, a big part of the path. And I do think that non-operator investors can be very valuable. We have another investor that works closely with us that's been in the business for like 40 years. And he has just like seen all of the reps. Like basically it's kind of what YC does of, they have so many different data points so that they can really pattern match and look at your situation and be like, oh, I know exactly another company that went through the same thing. And like, here's what happened to them. So I think those are the two archetypes that I find very valuable. It's the pattern matching types, and they've seen it all, and the operator types. There's definitely people who are, they're well connected or they've got a great brand name. Those are also helpful too. But yeah, I think those are the kind of two main like helpful archetypes in my mind.
To have this good problem, I'm guessing, to choose a great investor is assuming that you can choose from a big pool of people that want to invest. So how do you get to that point?
I know the market's very different these days, so I will share my experience in the past. I think there's a lot of art in fundraising for sure, and for creating a dynamic where you're creating a scarcity mindset. I think that's like the biggest like takeaway is like create a scarcity mindset and you can artificially manufacture a scarcity mindset, right? Of course, you want to do things that are true and honest, but there are tactics that you can employ to do that. The advice that YC gives, for example, is to get everyone on the same timeline and to like position yourself in a way where you have a lot of demand. And so in past fundraisers, what we've done is really try to line up all conversations over like a 2-week period. Start with ones where perhaps those are more practice rounds, like you're really kind of getting your feet wet, and then have that like go into the pitches that you really care about. If you have everyone on the same timeline, then you should be reaching stages of the process at the same time. So you'll be having first conversations at the same time. You'll be moving to second conversations at the same time, partner meetings at the same time, and then term sheets at the same time. So I think like, and then again, like kind of playing that up with the investors that are in the round, right? Like letting people know that you've got your calendar fully booked this week because you've got a lot of interest. Like those are all things that you can say and do to help support that scarcity mindset. Those are more of the tactics of fundraising, but obviously the best way to get a lot of interest is to have a fundamentally good business and to be in a growing market, like we said. So those are all assuming that you've gotten those things out of the way too.
Super. And let's speak a bit about the team. I believe you mentioned that you hired the first person during your time in YC. How did you grow the team over time, and what positions were you filling over time?
Yeah, great question. Yeah. So, we brought on mostly technical hires early on to build the product. And I thought that was really important for us because my co-founder and I are not technical. That's a big choice too. Of do you want to bring on a technical co-founder? And I definitely think that that's like a good path to take, and one that I would have considered more seriously back in the day. What we did though was bring on a number of engineers early on to help build the product. And my co-founder and I are the ones that stayed really close to customers. I would definitely recommend that. Like I do see people bring on their first head of sales or like go-to-market leader sub 1 million of ARR. And I think founders should stay close to the business at least through 1 million of ARR. You want to start bringing people on when you're in more of that scaling phase. But when you're trying to find product market fit and really validate that what you have is a real thing, like it's only the founders that can do that. That is your superpower, is like truly understanding your user. So you've got to stay close until then. So over time, we built out kind of the product engineering team, and then started to scale go to market as we like kind of crossed that 1 million of ARR threshold. Uniquely for our business on the health tech side, we brought on clinicians really early in our journey. Our first consultants were clinicians, and then we actually converted them to full time. As actually sub 10 employees, we brought on one clinician full time, and then our second clinician was, I think, between employee 10 and 20. And I thought that was really important for us specifically. The reasons why are multifold. My co-founder, again, was in medical school, so he has some of that training, but we really wanted someone who was dog fooding, like truly voice of the user in our organization. And I think that changes the entire ethos of your company. When you have your clinician user sitting with you at lunch, like you really deeply understand their problems. Like I have my CMO's like, P&L from her clinic. Like I understand every dollar that she's paying for because like I can parachute into her clinic and truly understand what's happening. So like those are really important things. The other big thing, aside from user empathy and voice of the customer within your organization, is that same ethos outward too. It depends on your kind of business, but for us, because we are selling to clinicians and because we're selling to life sciences, having the credibility of having multiple clinicians full time, I think set us apart from a lot of other companies. Many other companies have like amazing tech minds, which again, like super helpful, hands down can't be beat. But I think having clinicians on top of that really gave us that extra layer of we're built for you, we're built by you, and we're clinician first. So it's a really core part of our brand too.
I'm hearing very interesting opinions about the team culture. Did you form these during from the beginning or during the time that you were building Osmind? And then maybe how do you hire for the specific values you're looking for?
Great question. It's funny. We have 4 company values. They're the exact same values since when we started. And we have like continuously looked at them every year. We're like, hey, we should update our values. oh, wait, they're exactly the same. So I think that speaks to the like self-reinforcing nature of you create values, you hire people that align with the values. Those people continue to support those values. So it is this like self-reinforcing flywheel in a way. Um, yeah, I mean, I think hiring for values is really important. And a mistake I made early on was not staying close enough to hiring. I think if I were to do it again, I would probably interview every single person up to employee number 30 or 40. I think Tony at DoorDash interviewed every single person up to employee number 100. I know that doesn't scale, but I do think that even at this size, even at our size still, we're almost 60 people, every hire still matters and can really change the culture. So I do think it is the founders that like are still emanating the values, but you can also find key culture champions. And I would suggest that each person have at least one non-founder key culture champion on their leadership team. Not every single person on the leadership team needs to be like, rah, rah, like I have this banner of your company or whatever. Of course, they can't be net negative to your culture, but they've got to be able to. I think about our head of HR, for example. She's the one that delivers closing remarks at our company retreats or offsites or whatever. She is that emblematic of her culture. And I think you need one non-founder to do that to really scale the culture going forward. So that's one thing I would say. And then tactically speaking, in our interview process, we do have a bar raiser interview. So it's borrowed from Amazon's principles where we interview specifically for each of our 4 values. And we think to ourselves, is this person going to be average at the company or are they going to raise the bar? Are they going to like raise the bar on our cultural values? And we'll only hire them if so.
And in terms of having 60 people, I'm seeing that basically your capacity of leading that team changes because the dynamic is very different. You cannot like have one-to-ones with everyone.
Yeah.
How did you build a management team that is doing that work, or what's your view on scaling the team?
Oh, yeah, great question. Every founder struggles with this. I think it's a really tough transition, and you're smiling because I'm sure you've experienced some of that as well. Yeah, I think post Series A is one of those big milestones. And someone told me a really great analogy that stuck with me is before the Series A, like you and your team, and you're all in a rowboat. Like you're all rowing together. You're furiously rowing. You're trying to row as fast as possible to get to your destination. And after the Series A, like you need to get out of the rowboat and go to the control tower and like look on the horizon and see if there are storm clouds and tell your rowers what to do. Right. And I think that's a very different mindset. Like, of course, I'm not going to lie. I'm in the boat sometimes still. Like I'm there. I'm rowing with people. But like your time is much better spent being in that control tower and finding the right people to put on the boat. And to your point, I think the management team is really important. After the Series A is typically when you start hiring your management team and your leadership team. And you really have to trust them because to your point, you're not going to be able to meet with every single person at the company and know what every single person is doing. Managing managers is a big step, a big change in a CEO or a founder's role. So the management team is definitely really critical, but that mindset of like getting out of the boat and being in the control tower is really important too, because I think where I see a lot of founders stumble is they hire a management team, but they don't get out of the boat. They're like whispering over the management team's shoulder in the boat and like telling them what to do in the boat. Right. And like that's not going to set this person up for success. So I think that's where I had the biggest like stepwise change in my leadership and, with the biggest struggle too of trying to change that mindset. But at this point, it moves a lot more smoothly. Like you can do so much more when you've got people that you've empowered to help lead the team.
Where is Osmind going to be in 5 years' time?
I mean, our goal, our vision is to be the number one software for private practice psychiatrists and to be a part of every future drug approval in some way in psychiatry. So I want, and I know that there are so many new treatments that are in the pipeline right now that will be approved hopefully in the next couple of years. And I think Osmind can play a big role in helping to provide better data to inform those treatments, to help get those treatments to commercialization and to help providers be able to more easily administer them. So I think that's my goal in 5 years is to be a part of every single drug approval and to be the most popular and most useful software for providers as well.
Super. I wanted to ask you a bit. Lately, I've seen a lot of emphasis psychedelic medicine.
Yeah.
Insights there. I believe Elon was mentioning about his ketamine use and so on. What can we learn?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's really interesting topics of the boardroom when we talk about stuff like that. So I'm glad you brought it up too. I mean, in all seriousness, it's a very legitimate form of medicine, and there's like a very long history of psychedelic medicine. There's been indigenous use of psychedelic compounds for millennia, and then also big pharma studied psychedelics back in the 60s. However, in the 70s, a lot of the research was put on hold. There are many reasons for that. A lot of them are political, but while a lot of the research was put on hold, in the last 10 years, there's been a resurgence of interest in using psychedelic treatments such as LSD, psilocybin, MDMA, ibogaine, DMT, as actual psychiatric compounds. And many of these compounds are going through FDA clinical trials. The first one in this category was approved about 5 years ago by a drug developed by Johnson & Johnson that is essentially a form of ketamine. And it's actually Johnson & Johnson's fastest growing drug in its portfolio, in its entire portfolio. So I think that really shows both the unmet need and the potential it has from a commercial perspective, but also the clinical effectiveness, right, that it is gaining this much traction. So there are a number of other compounds that are currently in development. Approval for MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD is expected later this year, and psilocybin-assisted therapy is expected in 2026. So I think that's why there has been so much public attention to this. In a field that hasn't been innovated in so long, we're finally seeing new treatments that are highly clinically effective, that are critical for patients that need it.
Speaking about highly critically effective, do we have any evidence of how much better the results are?
Yeah, really good question. So yeah, I would definitely encourage folks to go and look at some of the research that's been published in MDMA. The clinical results are pretty astounding. I think MDMA-assisted therapy had like a 67% remission rate for patients that had on average 17 years of PTSD. I would need to check what the standard of care is. I'm pretty sure it's much below 67% remission. That's really incredible for something like PTSD that's highly complex. So yes, the clinical results have shown better results than standard of care. We actually published a big real world study on ketamine. So ketamine is also a treatment that's been used widely for depression, anxiety, and other disorders. And we found that there were highly significant response and remission rates as well. So like 50% of patients with depression and anxiety responded to ketamine infusion therapy. There have been a lot of studies on the standard of care and what traditional antidepressants do. Some estimate that traditional antidepressants only work for about 25% of patients. So something that's like 50% is much better. So yeah, a lot more research needs to be done. And that's a big part of why we're doing what we're doing. We're trying to collect more data and show like much longer timelines for some of these treatments. But very promising overall.
Super. For my last question, if we get 100 years into the future and we look backwards, what are the things that we're going to say in psychiatry that are totally wrong of what we're doing today?
Oh my gosh. Ooh, so many things, all the things. First off, using antidepressants as first-line treatment, using SSRIs as first-line treatment. Like, I think we will be much more open to saying like, hey, you should go straight to Spravato or you should go straight to TMS versus right now, usually what providers have to do is show that a patient has tried like 4 different antidepressants, failed them, and then only then does insurance cover, all these like other interventional treatments. So I think our whole treatment paradigm will change. I think we're going to use a lot more data. So that first intake where you go and talk to your psychiatrist and you're just talking for an hour, instead, we're going to go and we're going to plug our phones in and our psychiatrists are going to see, oh, hey, you've been using your socials in a certain way. You haven't been exercising. You haven't been sleeping. I know exactly what kind of depression you have. Of course, tell me your story because that's going to add to the data that we have. But we're going to have a much more rich picture using both objective and subjective data. So I think those are the two big changes that I foresee, a lot among many others in 100 years.
Super. Lucia, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.